And we're setting up your meeting for Facebook Live. Here
Live on Facebook.
we go. Do you see it?
Yes, I do.
Oh, great. So you should see it on your screen on Facebook. Hold on a second here.
Well, I suppose since I have the laptop in front of me,
Right, you could put that on the
I
page.
could put that on. Yeah.
Yeah,
See if we can put
and let's
Facebook.
see where we are here. So we're just setting up, and this is sort of the behind the scenes. If you're watching us wherever you are, I'm Emil Guillermo, the museum director, and welcome to us putting together our Facebook Live. Uh, this is we started doing our pop-ups because out of we just had to. We had to do these pop-ups because um, we were we were closed. We had to be closed, and and now we can say uh, the FANHS Museum, the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum, is open virtually. I mean, we can say that. I mean, we can say that. I think we can say that, right? I mean,
So email.
are, are we showing up on Facebook Live
I I
on the Facebook
I
page?
I don't see it,
Well,
but I
sometimes
did
there's a
see.
lag. Sometimes there's a lag.
I'm on the museum page, Filipino American National Historical Society Museum, and I'm looking at your entry.
Uh,
It says, oh, August 20th at 12 noon.
yeah. So,
Another, and you kind of butchered virtual. You spelled it vitrutal.
oh,
Uh,
oh God, you know why? It's because the screen is so darn small.
I know, I know, and your
That
fingers are so big.
my fingers are so. That's one of the few times I can say that. My fingers are so darn big.
So I wish I could fix that, but I can't.
I can
Another,
fix that. I'll fix that.
okay.
God,
Museum pop-up, remembering Thelma Buchholdt, first Filipina woman to serve in the Alaska state legislature. She was actually the first Filipino woman to serve in any state legislature in the whole United States.
we are gonna correct that. We
Okay.
are gonna correct that because that is an important thing, and this is just like here's the thing about Facebook Live. There is a little bit of a lag, and
Mhm.
so we are live, but it doesn't show it.
So somebody
Someone is what?
said create a Facebook
Oh, someone
event.
said Facebook event.
I don't know what that meant.
Well,
Oh,
meaning a Facebook event so people can show
I
up
think
and
I
they'll,
think that's a page.
yeah, so they'll know where it is. But
But people need to come to this page,
they
right?
need to come to this page, and suddenly we will show up. But see, we're talking live. I'm talking to live, and
I see past ones here, but I don't see.
yeah, it's not going to be there yet,
Okay.
but it should be there momentarily.
All righty.
Does that? I mean, it sounds.
No, it makes sense to me. I,
Yeah,
I
well,
feel like there's that lag, right? The
yeah,
lag
it
because
makes sense to me too, but I just like I'm looking at the controls here, and I'm not seeing the control for the live stream. So we'll see how. I mean, this is one of the things about technology when you're doing it all yourself. But it says live. It says live on Facebook, so we're live on Facebook. We should be there. It just takes a while. So
yep.
anyway, we are open. I think people have heard of our sob story. It's not really well. It's the universal sob story all around the world, and here especially here in California, we've had our numbers go up. The curve is somewhat flattening, but not the way we'd like to see it. But we were we were scheduled to go, right? We had a new board. I was appointed the new museum director. We're scheduled to go. We had a new exhibit Tony DeZuniga, his Marvel paintings and his art from his comic book drawings was they were on display at the museum, and then suddenly March 15th comes around and boom, we're closed. Okay, well
Yeah.
we'll be open in April. No. Well, we'll
Oh,
be open in May. No. Well, we'll be open certainly by the summer. We'll be open by June. No. And now it's been about 5 months, and I realized that we had to do something to show that the museum was open. And we had to do something to replicate the kind of programs that we did uh, at the museum. And you've been to the museum for those programs, right?
actually, I haven't. I haven't
I
been.
recall seeing you at least one or two of them, or you've been
I
to I know you've been to the museum.
I think I haven't.
Oh my goodness, who am I seeing? Do all
I've been.
Filipinos look alike or something? What
Oh heavens! You know what? I think I've seen you in all kinds of places, but not in Stockton. And I've been to Stockton to all kinds of places, but not to the museum because it was never open when I was in Stockton. And I know I've made arrangements to go out to the museum with people, and then things just
well,
happen. So
well, that's the reason why we decided to do this. We
yes,
decided
that's
we needed to do virtual Filipino museum, um, these programs because
yeah,
every third Sunday at the museum we would have a program. We would have a thing. We'd have either a presentation or I
right.
would do a Q&A with people, and we did it all last year. We were all set to do it this year, going strong, and then we've had to shut down.
Yeah.
I mean, look, as I've said, if you go on our Facebook page at Filipino American National Historical Society Museum, or the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum page, or the FANHS Museum page, where you will see it's actually Facebook calls it at FANHS Museum. You will get
Okay.
this preamble, and we'll go officially at 12 because I said our program would start at 12. But for the early birds out there, if you're an early bird, and how many Filipino early birds are out there? I mean, Filipinos aren't necessarily early birds. I mean, I know the early bird gets the worm, but not the Filipino early bird. They like to get the late worm. So we are here. Um, Titania Buchholdt, Ty Buchholdt joins me because we're going to talk about our program. She's essential to the program, which will begin at 12. But if you are here on Facebook Live now, you're getting the behind the scenes look of how are they putting on this Filipino American National History Museum pop up? How are they doing this? Well, you see my gong there. I'm getting because the virtual background sometimes reveals the gong. Oh, let me also explain to you this head thing. Now,
The tubao.
what is this, Ty? What is this called?
Tubao. Tubao.
A tubao. And I buy these tubals every time I go to a FANHS conference. So they happen every 2 years, and I've been to a few of them now. So I have a few of these things because I say, do I need a T-shirt? Do I really need a T-shirt? I need a tubao. Because a tubao, you don't have to say, oh, what size is it? You just get the tubao. So I got
Well,
this tubao, but I didn't have a need for a tubao because like I needed a t-shirt. I don't need a t-shirt, but I needed a tubao. I just didn't know it until COVID because
uh,
my hair has gone amok. My hair is amok. I'm look at my hair. My all my hair to my head, none to my face. This is 5 years growth here.
wow.
5 years here. All my hair is to my head, none to my face. So I'll never be mistaken for a terrorist. And this is kind of like a turban. I mean, when I bought this, you showed me how to use this. I know how to. I didn't
Yeah.
know. I didn't know the significance of having a thing like this thing. So I have a thing. If I did it right, I could have been the Pope. You know, I could or cardinal or just a guy with a thing around his head. But see, you could do things like you could do wear it like that. You could like I mean, it's
Yeah.
really quite the accessory, this Filipino tubao. So with my long hair, my lockdown locks, I have become more Filipino. I mean, as if that were more possible. I mean, my mother's Filipino, my father's Filipino. I'm not from the Philippines. I was born in San Francisco, which was at some point more Filipino than it is now.
Yeah.
But here I am, more Filipino because of my hair, because I need this thing which bunches it up together. I know it looks like I have my underwear in my head, but it's not. Thi- this is a two bow. Is that what it's called, Ty?
Tubao. Yeah.
Too
There's
bad. And
there's
I've purchased a number of them at the FANHS conventions, and this one is. I mean, some of them are made. I don't know. Are they're all imported or what? Tell me the story about.
well, look, the one that you're wearing is hand woven, and it's a traditional Maguindanao backstrap loom hand woven piece of cloth. If the weaver decides that they want to make a malong, which is the tube skirt out of it, then they just have a very large piece of cloth that is seamed in a couple of places. But if they wanted to go ahead and cut it up into these squares,
Yeah.
tubos actually do come in a couple of sizes. They come in tourist child size for the tourists who aren't going to wear it on their head or going to use it like as a handkerchief for their pocket.
A
And
hanky, a hanky. That my mom would
hunky,
call
yes. And then there's
hanky.
the regular size, which is the adult size. Um, my
This
calendar.
is a little longer. I noticed. So it could be a two-bow skirt.
Well, it's
I
made
mean,
the
if
same
you,
way.
yeah, I mean,
It's
if you
made.
put it together, if you quilted a couple of them together, it could be a skirt. It could be a, it could be like a loincloth kind of thing. I mean, it's a very versatile piece. It's a
It's
very
very
versatile,
versatile. Yes.
versatile
Yeah.
garment.
But what
That
I like
fabric.
about it is that it is hand woven on the backstrap loom, which is very traditional all throughout Southeast Asia. And in the Philippines, the backstrap loom is only really seen in the north and in the south, where the Spanish missionaries didn't get rid of it by using the Western box loom. So
Right.
there's a lot of places
So
that make hand weavings, but not the traditional hand weavings.
I am so happy though that you pointed out that this is a hand because I bought it at the at the FANHS conference. One of the
Mm-hmm.
I have another one that's a redder and also at every satellite FANHS event, I say I got to buy something. I'm not buying a T-shirt though. I don't need it. I need a two bow because this
Yeah.
is really Filipino-y, and because I have like I said, this COVID hair now, it has come in handy because ordinarily, and people who have seen these videos that I've done with the museum like in March or April, they'll notice I wore a baseball cap. Well, this is a Filipino baseball league cap, I would
Yeah.
say. You know, it's very versatile. You could like wring it in water, and it's very cooling in the hot weather. So, if you're tuning in to our Facebook Live, this is the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum pop up. The program starts at 12, but this is kind of like the preamble to get our thing up. Now, Ty, you got your computer onto the Facebook page. We're on, right?
I don't
Have we popped
see
up?
it, but maybe well it's 11:59 and I don't know if you said it was going to be at 12
I said it was
noon.
going to be at 12 noon, but so maybe they'll just pop it up at 12 noon.
So I'm seeing your announcement from 2 days ago and it's pinned at the top. Maybe if I scroll down.
No, now they're now
No.
saying we have our fans saying that they see us live. So we're
Oh,
live.
very nice.
We're live.
Very
So
nice.
if you are just tuning in, you know that if you said, today is Saturday, I'm going to plan a visit to Stockton to see the FANHS Museum. Right? I mean, I know you guys want to go to the FANHS Museum, but you know, you can't. You can't now. We're not going to let you in. You know why? Because we're not there. Because the state, the county, well, the government, they shut us down. They've said, no, you cannot open up your FANHS Museum, take your Filipino things, and stay home. That's what they essentially have told us. Of course, we felt very bad, kind of thoughtful. And we've been closed. Ty, we've been closed for 5 months.
Yes, I know.
We,
Yeah.
we, we have not been able to share anything with the audience. Our historical goods, our historical stories, our historical perspective about being a Filipino American. We have not been able to do that at all. And then suddenly I guess it was a lightning bolt, not one of those bad lightning bolts that caused a fire. And by the way, if you are in an area like in Sonoma or Napa or Fresno or, south, north of where the museum is, I hope you're safe. I pray that you're safe. These fires are terrible.
Yeah.
But you have the fires on top of COVID, on top of everything else. We've been shut down. It's I had this idea that we need to reach our people and let them know that we're still here and we're still Filipino and we're still that rhymes with something else. Some other people would say, "Oh, he was rhyming something another phrase that rhymes with here." No, we're here and we're Filipino still.
So
And
I'm not really sure. I have to say I'm not really sure though, even though we're here and we do have a fan watching, I'm not sure where one would look to find this pop-up on.
it's on the page. They got to find it on the page, and
Yeah, I'm
also uh, they got to scroll down, and you should maybe refresh your page because we're there,
okay.
and
I'm gonna keep looking.
and also, uh, I suppose we will take your questions. We'll take your or questions if we get them in a timely manner, or you can send it in chat to us. Uh, like I said, we've been shut down for all these months. Had this idea that, well, we'll go virtual because the virtual museum pop-up tells people that the museum is where you are. I mean, that's always been my point. And in our preamble, Ty, I asked you, you've been to the museum, haven't you?
Oh my goodness, I see myself. Yes, I have
Well,
not been to the museum.
I mean, the thing about the museum is a lot of people say, oh, it's over there in Stockton. I'm not going to go to it. I'm trying to start a move where people see the museum as a mecca, as a place to go. If you're Filipino American, you need to come visit where the Filipinos came first in the 20s and the 30s. And they did their thing with their asparagus hose and they put on their suits and they walked with their cocks, their fighting cocks, and they gambled and they had families and they lived their lives. You got to come visit. This is the mecca for Filipino Americans. And even if you
Yeah.
came here in the 1980s and the 1960s, if you were one of those Filipinos, you got to say, well, where did my forebears? Or how about where did my eight bears? Where did they come from? Where did they what did they undergo? Well, they came on a boat from the Philippines to San Francisco, and then they came on a yellow cab to Stockton, and
Yeah.
they formed this community, and that's why the museum is here. It's this is historical ground, Stockton,
Yep.
and that's why the virtual museum makes sense because if the museum is where you are, if you're in New York or Virginia or Chicago or Texas or LA or Seattle, do these pop-ups. You can experience the museum virtually. And that's why we do these pop-ups. And we started to do the pop-ups last week really was our first one. We had so much fun. I thought we got to do something this week. Now, what happened this week? We had the Democratic National Convention. We've got the Republicans coming up next week. We've got these two events sandwiching our pop-up, both sides. And we had the 100th anniversary of the suffragette movement, right? The winning the right to vote. This is the moment, the pop-up that we need to celebrate an extraordinary Filipino woman. Because if you want to talk about politician or say the power of the vote or someone who believed in democracy and the power of your franchise, which is not McDonald's or Jollibee. Franchise. By franchise, we mean your right to vote. Who is that? The woman who came to mind who represents living through history, right? You see something like the suffragette movement, you see something like, the conventions coming up. Who is Filipino American who represents all these ideas and who we can talk about here in our pop-up, but Thelma Buchholdt, the mother of Ty Buchholdt.
My mother, yes.
Your mother.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think a lot of people who know FANHS, the Filipino American National Historical Society, would say, "Oh yeah, Thelma, she was the president of FANHS for a while, for how many terms?
3 terms. She's
Three
the only
terms.
person
That
who ever did that.
that that is either gluttony or that is sacrifice or a believer, a true believer. What would you call it? 3 terms?
Well, she was a politician's politician, but she didn't run for 3 terms. She only ran for 2 terms. And when it was time for the third term, there was no vote because the trustees simply said, we will retain our current slate of officers.
You got to do
And
it.
so I've heard a couple different stories about that. I've heard a couple different stories about that. My mother told me in Hawaii at the FANHS conference in Hawaii in 2006 that she did not want to have a third term because she was preparing for the FANHS conference in Anchorage, which was going to be in 2008. And she said, that's going to be a lot of work. I think it would be a disservice for me to be president while I'm also preparing for this conference in 2008.
Always ethical. Look, and then but she was drafted. So if drafted, I will serve, right? I mean,
Yes, that's right.
look, here's the thing about Thelma. Not only was she the FANHS president, she is the first Filipina woman to serve on a state legislature anywhere in the United States. Did I give
Yeah.
her due? Did I say that correctly, Tom?
You said that right. I've heard it many different ways.
I mean, when you
And
think about this, think the first Filipina woman ever to serve on a state legislature. We just had a first Filipino, Rob Bonta in California, just a couple, cycles ago.
right.
But so you think of a Philippine, and what years did she serve on the Alaskan state legislature?
74 through 82, I think. It was 8 years. I I remember that when just before Rob Bonta was going to declare, or he had just declared, I was invited to a number of different meetings and asked to speak, to my surprise. Well, I'm from Alaska. I've lived in California for a while now. I was born in California, but I lived in Alaska for a really long time. I had no idea that there had yet to be a Filipino American legislator in California. And I was really shocked. So yes, my mother was the first Filipina American, the first female legislator in the United States. And I've often told people that's because she wasn't representing Filipinos and she wasn't representing Filipino Americans. She was just the best person for the job. So she was just a very effective, very hardworking, very ethical legislator. And she had the pleasure of serving 4 terms before she was illegally gerrymandered out of her district. And it was an illegal gerrymander, went to court 12 years later, the court threw it out, but she'd moved on at that point. And
So it was gerrymandered by
the Republican Party.
See, this is the thing about your mom. She was a Democrat in a
Yes.
Republican state,
Yes.
enjoyed a long career there. And I've
Yes.
been up to the district where they have a community center in her name. It's a very mixed center. I mean, it's not all Filipino.
She was very strategic. She was very, very good at seeing how she could bring people together. She was a person who believed in ideas that she could get a lot of consensus. I mean, what's the use of fighting to achieve something and then having it all fall apart, which is all too often the case. So she would think long and hard about what she needed to do to effect a change that would be lasting. And so, yes, I believe you're referring to the Alaskan Asian Cultural Center.
Yeah. She brought me up there to speak, and I was just amazed. And and you point out her constituency in Alaska was like 90% white and about 2% Asian, really.
2% Asian, and the number 1, Korean, number 2, Japanese, number 3, Chinese. And I think they were, I think at one point she figured out that there were 8 or 10 Filipino voters in her district, but they were Republicans. So she did not become a legislator to represent Filipino American interests, though that is what she did.
Yeah.
She had a plan of how she would effect change, and change that was really needed.
All right, now before we get into some of the nuts and bolts about your mom, Thelma Buchholdt, who is on, there's a picture of her on display in the women's section of the FANHS Museum in Stockton.
That's good.
We'll try to share that on our Facebook page, but I want to welcome people who are just catching us now on the Facebook Live. Um, Tell your friends about it. They can come join us. We'll accept some questions if we can get to them in our technology, our limited technology here. We're joined with Ty Buchholdt, who is Thelma's daughter. Tell me more, Ty, about your mom. What part of the Philippines was she from, and when did she come here to America?
My mother was born in a little, very little fishing village that had been established in the late 1800s. The original village was along the Kabicungan River, where the river joins the ocean in Cagayan province in the north. And there were a series of floods of the Kabicungan River, so people got tired of it after the series of floods. So they moved a village. A bunch of people had to take shelter at a fishing cove that was not far away from the river. And about that time, when people said, you know what, when the flood waters go away, we're just not going back to the Kabicungan River. It just keeps flooding. Never mind. We're just going to stay where we're at. So they decided to establish a more of a permanent village, and they got their permission of the local authorities to go ahead and do that. At about that same time, my mother's grandfather was a teenager living in Loag in Ilocos Norte.
Oh,
And
you're my family, Ilocos Norte.
yeah, right. So her grandfather was a teenager, probably about 16 or 17 years old, but he was in a very large family, and he was not going to inherit because he wasn't the eldest or even close to the eldest. So he and one of his brothers were given a sum of money and told to go find their fortune.
Really?
And so at that time, he found out that there was this new village, and property was cheap because there really was nothing there, but it wasn't completely in the middle of nowhere. There was a fishing cove, so people weren't starving. They had food. So he and his brother sort of wandered a bit east of Loag, and then they found themselves there, and then they had their money. They bought some land there. So they were some of the first landowners in a town that was named after the Spanish governor of the Philippines, Narciso Claveria. So of most Filipino Americans might know that name because of something that was called Claveria's Edict, where Filipinos, in order to assist the Spanish with collecting taxes, had to have uniformity in their names.
That's the guy, Claveria.
Claveria.
He was all. That's why I'm a Guillermo, right?
Right. That's also why my mother became a Garcia, because
what were the family name before Garcia?
We don't know. My mother's father was indigenous, but it's kind of a long story. I don't want to go into it too much, but the fact was that everybody either changed their names to a Spanish name that was on Claveria's list of names, or else it was changed for them. And so my mother's mother, she had a Spanish last name. Her grandfather had a Spanish last name, but they were Ilocano. And they had originally come from Ilocos Sur in the early 1800s, had moved up to Lawag. And in the late 1800s, my great-grandfather moved to Claveria, a town that became called Claveria.
So is that now was your mom in Claveria?
My mother was born in Claveria. No. She was born in Claveria in 1934. She was her parents' first child. They had been married about a year and a half earlier. My grandmother was the youngest of 8 or 9 children, might have been 9. She was the youngest. Her father had 5 children with his first wife. His first wife passed away, and so he went to go find another wife, and that was my great-grandmother, and she had 4 more children. And every one of those children, other than my grandmother, came to America.
So
Every single one of them.
how did your mom get here? Because the older daughters or older siblings came here first?
Right. Everybody came first. And even my grandmother wanted to come, but her mother, my great-grandmother, said, like, no, you're my last child. You are not leaving me. And in fact, of the 5 half siblings, my grandmother's half siblings, the older ones, were never heard from again at all.
They
And
were
so
lost in the
they came to America and were never heard from
oh,
again.
they just went on the boat, the dollar boat.
And they were never heard from. So my grandmother had 3 older brothers, and they also came to America. And they were heard from again. One disappeared, though, never to be heard from again at some point. Never heard from him again after the 40s. We don't know what happened to him. One of them passed away very young. He was 42 of a stroke. He settled in Chicago, married an Irish American woman, and had children, and then passed away. And then the 3rd brother, he was my mother's very beloved uncle, who became her father when she was a teenager, because after he had been working in America for many, many years, when World War II came out, well, when the Filipino military groups down in Camp Beale in California became a reality, he was working in a resort in Florida, and he heard about that, and he heard that was a way that he could get his citizenship. So he immediately quit his job and he joined up the military immediately. And he was, I think, in the first infantry?
Right. So he was in World War II.
World War II, he got his citizenship, and then he looked around to see what he could do. Now, he had learned how to cook. He had been working as a cook in resorts in Florida. Well, he went to Las Vegas, and he became a chef in Las Vegas. He was the only Filipino chef in Las Vegas in the 50s.
The long line of Filipino cook. My father was a cook, and he wanted to come to California and work the restaurants, not work in the valley, because he wanted to cook the vegetables, not pick the vegetables. So now you're so now how does your mom get in the act here?
So because my mother's uncle had come to America when he was very young, he was a manong. He never married. His brother got married to an Irish woman. I don't know how they did that. That was in Chicago. But my uncle never married. And so after World War II, and he'd had accumulated some money working as a chef in Las Vegas, he went back to visit his mother. So finally his mother got to see more than one of her children. So he went back, and my grandmother was married at the time, and my mother was the eldest. And so my great uncle said to his sister, I will take your child, you send her to me when it's time for college, I will send her to college. And so in 1951, my mother left the village, came to America, and she was enrolled at, was basically a very fancy boarding school in Brentwood, California, in Los Angeles, up in the mountains. It was quite a culture shock, but the place was an all-women's school run by nuns. The convent was also there. And so it was a place where her uncle felt, him being an older single man, he didn't really know what to do with a teenage girl, and he'd made that promise. So he shopped around a lot, found this really swanky place, and sent her to college there. And so that's how my mother ended up coming to America.
So it was about 19 what?
It was 1952. My mother graduated in 1957. She told me, I asked her one point why she didn't graduate in 4 years, and she said that was because when she came to America, she thought she spoke English. And then she found out that she didn't speak American English. She said she had the hardest time understanding what anybody said. And she said her whole first year of school, she was just trying to figure out what people were saying. Her accent was very, very thick. When I was a teenager, I came home from school one day and I saw that my mother had been cleaning up in her bedroom. I was probably about 12 or 13 years old. And I found that she had a scrapbook I'd never seen before. She dug it out of somewhere. And in that scrapbook, I found one of those recordings, those you used to be able to, in the 50s, go in to these booths. Now there's still booths where you can have your photos taken, photo booths. But this is a recording booth where you could record yourself onto a disc, a paper disc. It was like a square disc, but you could just record yourself. Well, this was a long time ago, folks, before computers, before digital technology, before lots of things. And so she and her college girlfriend went in and they recorded a message, and it was a message. She was going to send it to her mother, but then she didn't send it to her mother. So she had it so many years later, and she has the thickest accent I have ever heard. It was so thick, I had to listen to it over and over again to understand any of it other than the, saying hello to her mother. I couldn't understand it.
She said, "Hello, Mom. I'm doing okay. I'm okay."
Kind of like that. She found out, though, when I was a teenager, she found out that I had listened to it, and I think she destroyed it. She didn't want anybody to hear her with that thick accent.
You spoke really well. To be a legislator too, you needed to speak well. All right, tell me, she's in college. Where did she go to college?
So she went to college at our Mount St. Mary's, which was
that's the Loyola Marymount, right?
No, Loyola Marymount is on the other side of Santa Monica. So she went to school. When I was a child, I remember being brought to her college campus so that all the nuns could see how I was growing and could see my younger brothers and all of that. And at the time, there was nothing to be seen up in those mountains, nothing at all. Then in the 70s, you could see a millionaire's house in their helicopter pad because there was no road. Now, all you see is the Getty Museum. So if you go to the Getty Museum and you see this gigantic complex way over there and you say, what is that? That is Mount St. Mary's.
So Mount St. Mary, and then from Mount St. Mary's, like I know that she went to law school in Washington, D.C. How did she find herself there? I mean, after college, she went into
well, my mother eventually, she worked on her accent a lot. She understood, not only did she understand, she couldn't understand other people, what they were saying. She also found people didn't understand what she was saying. So she worked on her accent a lot. And I think she might have had some little speech lessons when she was in college to try to improve her understanding of others. The teachers there, the nuns at her college, got her a job as an elementary school teacher at a Catholic elementary school. And she worked even more on her losing her accent or developing a different kind of an accent. And it was when she was working as a teacher at St. Mark's Elementary in Los Angeles, is still in business. She had met my father when she was attending summer school. In between semesters of school years at Mount St. Mary's. And she continued to go to school because she was in the US on a student visa. Well, she met my father. My father often said that it was love at first sight. They were married as soon as my mother graduated. The nuns got her a job. She immediately put my father into college, and she put him through school. And as soon as he got out of school, as soon as he graduated, and he went to Loyola, before it was Loyola Marymount. So my mother went to an all-women's Catholic college, and my father went to an all-men's Jesuit institution. As soon as my father graduated, he needed to get a job. He'd been married to my mother for 4 years, and they had 3 children. So he needed to get a job.
That's very Catholic. Okay.
That's very Catholic, yes. So he ended up getting a job because his degree was in American literature, and there's not a lot out there for people with American literature degrees. He ended up getting a job as the director of a public health clinic, which helped me to understand and anticipate COVID-19, believe me. So when they got that, when my father got that job, he ended up sort of job surfing through the federal government. And that's what brought us up to Alaska in 1965. And eventually, my parents went into business together, planning health, education, and welfare services for rural Alaska. They worked with the indigenous people of Alaska. This is before the Native Land Claims Settlement Act. This is before pipeline. So my parents worked a lot with the indigenous people, especially people who were living in areas that had no services, because the federal government had become aware that the poorest people in the United States in the 60s are people living on reservations, and even poorer than them were the Native Americans who are not even living in reservations. There are no reservations in Alaska. So these are people who are living almost Stone Age. I mean, they were still going out there with harpoons and trying to get whales in their boats that were made out of walrus skin stomach. And this was in the 60s.
Yeah,
So
so
we had,
yeah, this would
yeah,
have to be like what, late 60s, like 68, during the time where there was a kind of cultural
this
revolution
was,
going on, or was it early?
yes, it was late 60s. Yeah, because it was, although we went to Alaska because my father had the job with the public health service with the federal government in the mid 60s, eventually my parents decided that they would go ahead and, through connections, people who they meet at parties, and they were a very interesting couple, but people seemed to give them all sorts of opportunities. They said Alaska was the land of opportunity. There was a lot available, especially for my mother, because my mother, being dark skinned, she was able to go into villages my father had already been to, because my father had been flown to almost every single village in the state while he was working in the US government's campaign to get rid of smallpox. So he had been to all of these villages, and my mother ended up going to these villages. My parents would put together these not too long, maybe 20 or 30 pages questionnaires. And my mother would go door to door in a village, and then they would collate the answers, and then they would come up with a plan that they would go to the federal government with funding to try to bring these villages into the 20th century, if it was possible. And so my mother sometimes she would go into these places, and people like, you're not white, but you're not black. Well, what are you? And sometimes people didn't even ask her. They just figured she was just from another tribe.
Another
So
Indian tribe.
yes,
Yeah.
that's right. I
So
mean,
here she is.
me, yeah, me growing up in Alaska, many times I was assumed that I was at the basket. People would come up to me in grocery stores and start talking to me in their language. So anyway, my mother ended up really understanding the culture of rural indigenous Alaska, and really being embraced by the people. And she had a lot of charisma. My mother did. People were happy to talk to her. People were happy to have her come in, and she was also so gorgeous too. So certainly they wanted her in their house.
You know, it's no surprise she became a politician, because when you do the kind of work you were just describing, going to the indigenous and trying to get them what they deserve, get them a piece of, the public, to get, really, it's not a matter of they're aggrieved. They needed an advocate. They needed someone to fight for.
Yes, that's right.
And your
That's right.
mom was there, and she was collecting those surveys, and they went to the federal government. Did she get the money? Did she?
Yes, that's my parents made a living for many years that way. They would uh, they would supply copies of every single questionnaire, and sometimes the very first question would be, "What do you want most in your village? Running water, electricity, radio, mail service, health service." I mean, there was all kinds of things that these villages didn't have any. I mean, some of them still don't have. But my mother ended up really understanding the entire state. Um, Years later, I think when they were kind of still doing that kind of work, my mother and father became involved in an offshoot of the Alaskan Democratic Party, um, which decided that they were going to be more progressive. And my mother was asked to run for office in her district
In Alaska?
in Alaska. Yeah.
So now,
And
is this before this is after she became a lawyer?
Oh, my parents didn't go to law school until quite late in life, and they were in their 50s
Wow.
when they went to law school.
So here
Yes.
they were just activists. They were out there fighting for the people. They were so effective that the political parties noticed them and said, "You need to represent this district." And then
Right.
what did she say?
My mother, because my mother had been a school teacher, she had actually been involved. Well, let me go back a little bit. My mother did not receive her American citizenship until 1967. So when she did that, then she was able to vote.
So
And when she was
she came here in 52.
52.
And then at 67, she was able to vote. What was the hangup? Was it just the bureaucracy? Was it she needed?
I'm not sure what that was.
She was a green
I'm
card
not
holder.
really sure.
She was a green card holder, though, right?
She had a green card. Yeah, she had a green card.
By your uncle.
She had a green card because she married my father.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, she married my father in 1957 because she was in the US as a college student. So she had a student visa. But when she graduated from college, married my father, she was able to apply for the green card. My father had been in the US Navy in Nevada, which I always thought was something else. but he had been in the Navy. He joined the Navy when he was 15. Because back then you didn't have to have a birth certificate to join the military.
And your father, whose first name escapes me, Mr. Buchholdt, his first
John.
name, John. That's
John.
right.
Jon. John.
So, and I've met him several times, and I apologize for his name escaping me. But
It's okay.
John, uh, he was Caucasian. That was a striking pair. But they kind of double teamed everybody because she could go into places where he couldn't. And
Right, exactly. So my father was 6 foot tall, blonde, blue-eyed, very young, very youthful looking. My mother was 5 foot tall, black hair, black-eyed, and they were a very striking couple. But it is really true that my father was able to work on government contracts and could maneuver in and out of government offices because he was a federal worker for so many years. He had no problem going to Washington, D.C., submitting information, all that sort of thing. My mother was the person who could go into any village anywhere in rural Alaska and everyone would be like, really want to talk to her. So yes, they made quite a pair. Also, my father was the idea person. Great imagination, extremely articulate, really could come up with all kinds of ideas. My mother was his editor. She was the person who would go through his writing, fix it up, see where the holes were. They were a very good pair that way.
all right. So they were noticed, as I said, by the political parties. She was asked to run to represent the area, and she said yes.
She said she would. So initially, we're skipping something here. After she got to vote, she joined the League of Women Voters, and she became very involved in that. And she did a lot of volunteer work with the League of Women Voters and some other work with the typical types of charities of the time, March of Dimes, American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, that sort of thing. And she decided, people asked her if she would run for school board. So that was her first political campaign, was running for school board, and she lost by very little. So little. It was amazing. People thought that she didn't have a chance because she was the only person of color. And she, though, was fantastic when she would go door to door. People would just be bowled over and they would remember her. And that was actually the secret to my mother's political success in Alaska, is that she would go door to door. She knew where everybody lived. She knew everybody's names. She knew how everybody had already voted because she'd memorized the voters' rolls, and it was amazing. She knew what parties they were in. She was able to present herself to people who wouldn't let her in the door if she was Black, wouldn't let her in the door if she was Native, but they didn't know what Filipino was. So they would let her in the door and she would knock them over. I mean, she would be so smart and so good at what she talked about that she would say, tell your friends. And so people who absolutely loved her would tell their friends, and by the way, wouldn't say that she wasn't a white woman. So my mother got a lot of votes from people who thought she was white. in
Oh,
part because she had a political campaign manager who said that if she appeared in print, if her picture appeared in print or if it was in commercials, nobody would vote for her. But with a name like Thelma Buchholdt, that was not exactly, you know, a person of color's name.
yeah.
It's a Danish name, and in fact, because it is a Danish name, um, her first political campaign manager said, "We are going to make your signs Copenhagen blue and white."
So it kind of worked to her advantage in a way. How did did she see her? How did she see her Filipino Americanness develop, or did she see it as being a plus, or was she really how Filipino? She didn't ever deny her Filipino-ness.
No, no, and it was one of her complaints that there are people in Alaska who have Filipino backgrounds and would never ever admit it. They'd never talk about it. She'd invite them to talk at events and they just like never, never, never. My mother was never that way. But when my mother came to America, she didn't really realize anything much about Philippine history because she's just a teenager. She just come out of World War II. I think she only went to elementary, junior high school, junior high school and high school. I think she only went for like 5 years because she was displaced and homeless during World War II. Her family home had been taken over by the Japanese officers. So she hadn't been able to go to school for very long. She didn't know much about the Philippines. And after her death, I found some recordings that had been made when the local public radio station in Anchorage had recorded sort of a talk program that had taken place over a series of weekends one summer in Anchorage at the Anchorage Library. And in it, she said that she didn't even know what being Filipino was about, but all of a sudden here she was in Brentwood and the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, the Eagles, the Elks, all these clubs were asking her to come talk about the Philippines because she was the only Filipino they knew and she didn't know any other Filipinos. So she had to educate herself so she could give a talk about it.
This is
And
kind
it was,
this is kind of the Filipino American experience, though, right? That
yes, it
you
is.
come
It
in,
is.
your group is not dominant. You somehow manage to integrate yourself into the mix, and then your Filipino-ness comes out. Because
Right.
I mean, when she ran for legislator, how did
Yeah.
the Filipinos view her?
So my mother, I have a very good friend who said that my mother became a born again Filipino when we moved to Alaska, which is really true.
Really?
Because when we moved to Alaska in 1965, I was the eldest in the family. My mother would send me down to the corner store to buy, groceries, buy milk, buy whatever for dinner, while she stayed home with my younger brothers. And one day I was leaving and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that there was a flyer had been posted on the neighborhood bulletin board in the store, in the corner store. And I saw the word Filipino and I immediately turned around and looked at it again. And I read the whole thing, and it was something about Filipinos in Anchorage. I didn't know what that was. I mean, so I ran home about a block away, and I said, "Mommy, there's a sign about Filipinos." So she sent me back to look at it again and to copy it down with a pencil and paper. So I copied it down, and I ran back home and gave it to her. And she said, "Watch the kids." And she ran down to the corner store. And it turned out that the Filipino community of Anchorage, Alaska Incorporated had just been formed and had its first meeting a couple of months earlier. My mother had missed it. Well, that had been started by a number of couples who had lived in Anchorage for decades. I think decades. And one of these couples, I think it was 5 different couples. One of these women had been a librarian at my mother's elementary school in Claveria, Cagayan.
Oh, in
What are the odds?
wow.
And so my mother immediately became involved in the organization, Filipino Community of Anchorage, Alaska. And so I got to grow up as a child surrounded by Filipinos from the Philippines who had come to Alaska during World War II, and then found out that Filipinos had come to Alaska even earlier, had come to Juneau during the gold rush. And then my mother got more and more involved in the history. And of course, she wrote the book, Filipinos in Alaska, 1788 to 1958, which was first published in 1996.
Well, I mean, because at the museum we talk about the Elisqueros, we talk about the guys, the Manongs, who were the migrants who headed up to the canneries, and
Yeah,
most notably was Larry Itliong,
right.
but they were there before.
Yes. Yes, my mother didn't know any of that. So one of the first things my mother did, she did when, her election for the state house. She was invited by the political action group to run for her district. She won. She and I think 5 different legislatures that year came from that political action group. My mother was, I think, the one who was reelected over and over and over again. But my mother ended up finding positions of responsibility really smart, really quick, really good at figuring out strategy, really, really good at it. And my mother, she actually did the work of 4 or 5 different jobs, because she not only had the job of being vice chair of the Alaska State House Finance Committee, which was a very powerful position to have, especially during the Alaska pipeline years, where there was so much money coming into the state. She really wanted to be chair of the committee, but she couldn't quite manage it. What happened was she was given the chairmanship of the Alaska State House Committee for Health, Education, and Social Services. It used to be called Health, Education, and Welfare. So she was chair of that committee and vice chair of the Finance Committee, which is just an impossible task for people to do. There was so much work. But on top of that, she also would travel throughout the entire state, and she would take note of Filipino American communities. She made it her goal, and she achieved that goal, of meeting every single person in the entire state of Alaska who had any kind of Filipino heritage.
Wow, as a young man, this seems foolish to me now. I went to New York City thinking I'm going to meet every Filipino. Foolish now, but I actually did. I'm gonna meet every Guillermo. I'm gonna be related to everyone, and I almost got shot the first time I knocked on someone's door. No, not that bad, but pretty bad. But in Alaska, you can get away with that, and of course, the Filipinos embraced her, right?
Some did. I have to say that she had the best luck with certain families who were in southeastern Alaska, where their grandfather was the Filipino who had come long before World War II. So my mother's book talks about not every Filipino in Alaska, because for many, many years, she would tell people she was writing this book, and, send me something, send me the picture, send me a copy of the picture. A lot of people just didn't do it. And then she told me that when the book did come out in 1996, she got all kinds of phone calls and letters from people saying, how come you didn't put my father? How come you didn't put my uncle? Why didn't you? And she's like, as she had told me when we were working on the book together in late 96, that she knew a lot of people were going to be coming back and saying, how come my, relative is not in there? And she'd say, how many times did I see you? How many times in the past 20 years have I told you to send me something? And I asked her, it's like, well, are you going to do a revision and add the stuff in? She goes, no, that was so much work to put this book together. She worked on it for 20 years, so much work to do it. Yeah. And she said she felt that what needed to be done, rather than a revision of a book of the history from 1788 to 1958, was somebody to write from 1959 on. So that was statehood. Right. She felt that was much more important.
Well, yeah, that is important. It's still yet to be written, but 1788, the first Filipinos, actually, how did they come into play?
So my phone is going to die soon. How much time do we have left?
Don't you have a little plug? I have to get to the good parts.
So 1788 1788. My mother had been working on the book for about 20 years. Her first term as a legislator, she was able to get funding for a short film. She was able to put forward a project and have it approved on the history of Filipinos in Alaska. And they were able to hire a historian, a professional historian, to do some work and put together a half-hour documentary about it. But it wasn't a lot of money. It was just a little bit of money. My mother said it wasn't as good as it could have been, but it's not like they had an unlimited budget.
No.
She said she was just very grateful to get it started. It was also an inspiration for her that she was going to work on that. So she would go throughout the state and she would talk about how she had this like very short documentary and how she wanted to expand on it. And that was sort of her entry into people's scrapbooks, into their closets, into the paperwork, and find out about their family history so she could find out all about that. And I remember after we had all gone to Washington, D.C., we graduated from law school, we were all back in Alaska again. I remember going with her to a party at a friend's house, and there was a scholar from Stanford, and he was half Filipino. And my mother started talking to him and she said, well, I've been working on this book, Filipinos in Alaska. And I said, oh, for heaven's sake, Mom, that's like so long ago. You're not still working on that. Yes, she was still working on that, it turned out. And
he had the information on the 1788 folks?
So she didn't have that information. She said she was waiting for funding. And this is a really big deal. She had so much experience on where money was in the state of Alaska, where she could knock some loose. And she lucked out. I think all Filipino Americans lucked out when a woman who had been one of the few female legislators in the mid-1970s, the same time as my mother had been a legislator, but had been a Republican, when that woman was named Speaker of the House in the Alaska State Legislature. Well, even though they were from different parties, the women legislators hung out together because they had a lot in common, even though they were from different parties. Well, my mother had never stopped getting in touch with that one woman who had become the Speaker of the House and was able to convince her to sponsor a bill so that my mother could get funding to finish the book. And my mother had a plan. Of course, she didn't get all the funding. I think she got even just a quarter of the funding that she sought. But in putting together the plan, she knew that in the Spanish museums, there was a lot of material there that had not been looked at for the ships that had come up to Alaska from Acapulco. And these are the ships that had left Zamboanga to Acapulco, gone up to Alaska to get furs, then gone to China to sell the furs to the Chinese, get silks, go back to Zamboanga, refit the ship, take the silks back to Acapulco, where they would meet people from Spain who had come with all kinds of Spanish-made goods, had landed in the Caribbean, walked across the isthmus, and then they had traded the goods. So the Chinese goods went to Spain, and the Spanish goods went to Alaska, where they were traded for furs.
Wow. And so that's the 1788.
Yes. So in 1788, there was a captain from one of the Spanish galleons who was writing in his diary just a footnote that they had a Filipino who they'd been using as an interpreter. He didn't actually speak any of those languages, but he was very good at making himself understood. And so when they wanted to trade furs with the native Alaskans in Southeast Alaska, they would send him. Well, in this footnote, the captain says that, yes, when their interpreter went, as they were getting ready to leave, the native Alaskans said, why are you leaving with them? You're one of us. Stay here. Stay here. And so the captain very proudly said, no. Our Filipino interpreter said, no, I am staying with my people on that ship. Well, for one thing, I don't think that the Filipino interpreter really wanted to stay in Alaska. I think he wanted to go back to the Philippines.
But that was
someday.
The first Filipino in Alaska.
That was the first documentation of a Filipino in Alaska. We can only assume that the Spanish galleon ships had been using Filipinos as interpreters since the very beginning.
See, now, if I want to acknowledge again, if you're just joining us here in our pop-up and you've come here to the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum pop-up, we do this because as a museum, we've been shut down, but we are here virtual. This is the virtual museum. We're talking to Titania Buchholdt, who is the daughter of Thelma Buchholdt. If you're a FANHS partisan, you know how Thelma was an important part of FANHS, the president for 3 terms, but she was also the first Filipino woman legislator of in a state house in all of America, right? I mean,
that's right, in the entire United States, yes.
I mean, I just want to make sure that we give her Jackie Robinson moment the proper level of respect, because some people say, oh, was she the first she couldn't have been the first Filipino, first Filipina, definitely.
Right. The first Filipino who ever became a legislator was in Hawaii. There were some legislators in the territorial state house, and then once Hawaii became a state, there were some Filipino men who became legislators. But I often say, yes, they had a constituency that looked just like them. My mother has accomplished something that I think even today would be impossible, which is to be representing 90% people not of your initial culture. My mother, though, I think she learned a lot about mainstream white culture in America when she went to her swanky college in Brentwood, California. I think she learned a lot about it. And
you mean the swanky prep school?
Well, it wasn't a prep school, it was a college. She did get her a bachelor's degree in biology. The plan was that since she was the eldest of her siblings, she would be sent to America and she would go to medical school.
Oh, be a doctor, Filipino doctor.
To be a doctor, right.
They wanted that stereotype. Now, when I said Mount St. Mary's was both a convent and a college.
Yes.
Like all in one.
Yes.
The thing in Brentwood, yeah. So, all right. So just to correct myself there.
Okay.
So she learned a lot about, tell me about when she got elected and she served. Did she tell you anything? What was it like to be the daughter of a legislator?
There was a lot. So I'm going to actually plug my phone in. How much time do we have?
Well, we have a few minutes.
A few minutes. So my mother had been a school teacher, as you recall. She had been a Catholic school teacher dealing with 3rd graders. And so she somehow was able to take that part of herself and establish herself among all these white men, middle-aged and some of them younger, because Alaska's a younger state. She was able to establish herself as the authority figure. So even though she was only 5 foot tall and she was the darkest person there, and there were very few women, she was everybody's teacher. Wow. Which was pretty amazing. So at one point, she would send off for each of her children one at a time to come visit her when she was working in the legislature during the legislative session, just one at a time. So we'd have one-on-one time with her. We'd come for a weekend or stay for a week. One year I came down and one of my classmates from junior high school and high school was a legislative aide. I hadn't seen her for years. Her name was Cindy Sisson. Her father was an attorney in Anchorage, and Cindy was a huge fan of my mother. Never really knew my mother at all. Came to the legislature to be an aide and said that my mother had so much authority. My mother was able to speak in such a way that everybody had to listen. She would speak in a way that wasn't necessarily loud, but was never strident, but it was a way that commanded attention. Years and years and years later, after my mother's death, I heard her in a recording saying that when she was a child, her grandmother would take her down to the beach and have her speak to the waves and would coach her on how to do public speaking. So my mother had this voice of authority, and at the time, the legislature was in the old Capitol building. So the state house was on one side of the wall and the Senate was on the other side of the wall. You could be on the Senate side of the wall. And my mother would get up to speak and everybody in the Senate could hear my mother. She was the only legislator that everybody could hear her. So the Senate would actually pause while she talked and they would hear her talking. So it was quite remarkable what she was able to do. And yet my mother would work 12 to 15-hour to 16-hour days every single day. She was a mystery to most legislators because a lot of legislative deals took place at the bar down the street at the hotel. And my mother never was seen at the bar. She didn't drink and she didn't have anything to do with those negotiations. She did all of her work in the state capitol building. She worked so hard. And she told me one time that she would be at the end of a committee meeting. And then she'd say, well, tomorrow, this is the agenda. And people would just look at each other. The men would look at each other like, that's impossible. And she would work until 4 a.m, get up and be there at 7 a.m, and she'd have all the work done. And they just go, whoa. So that is how she was able to push a lot of things through. They had time constraints. She was doing the work. And these men were like, couldn't figure out how to even do that kind of work and also still go to the bar. So,
what surprised you? Wrote something recently about your mom. You said, she taught me that policy creates no change without consensus and implementation, and immediate change is impossible in the absence of funding. So
yes, funding.
You mentioned that, how she got the money to do all her different projects.
Right.
But now, consensus and implementation. I must confess that I learned about consensus when I served on a parish council, and they wanted to build a building, and you're there on the council for the right reasons. There was no reason to disagree on how many parking spaces or how big the building would be. You found consensus. That's how I learned how politics should work. But on a big level, like where your mom was playing, it seldom works.
Yeah.
How did she do it? How did she build consensus?
She was quite amazing. So it took me a really long time to understand. I knew that my mother was not like regular people. She could go into a room that would make you or me like shake in our shoes, but not her. She was extremely brave and she was extremely secure, and she really was able to figure out what was going on. So one of the things I figured out after we graduated from law school was that my mother actually had a little bit of auditory processing disorder. So she was very good at body language. And politics, the stereotype is that politicians lie. Well, they especially lie to each other when they're negotiating. My mother was so good at negotiating. People would come to her door and they would say one thing, but she'd be watching the body language to see what was really going on. She had an edge on other people. And she understood more of what was going on in a room than anybody else did. She really, really did.
Well, that's something, because they say that when you give a speech, wordy guys like me, well, words have so little impact on how people are moving. It's facial expression, it's physicality, it's all of that. Maybe 70-80% of communication is through that. And the words, less than 10%, really.
Right. Right.
It's uncanny. But you're saying your mom had this feel for this. She had a
Yes.
deficit on the one hand that she compensated for by just having a sense for how people were communicating physically.
I don't even think it was compensating. I think it was really kind of a superpower on her part. My mother could speak, and she had to speak extemporaneously about anything. And she could find out any kind of information in a meeting, immediately process it, immediately give her analysis of the situation. She just bowled over these, I'm sorry to say, old guys. These old guys, they would just look at her like, how is this even possible? So she was able to get a lot done because they oftentimes found she was so fair as well. She really did believe in consensus. She was not a person who said, I am entrenched here, you've got to come to me. she was a person who really knew how to do the give and take, as well as being everybody's teacher.
So
Yeah.
he's the ultimate politician, really. I mean, you called her earlier the politician's politician.
Yeah.
Just had a convention. We have another convention coming up next week. And this convention not only coincided with the 100th anniversary of the suffragette movement and the women's right to vote, but we had an historical figure, Kamala Harris,
Yes.
the vice presidency, first Black, first Asian American, first Indian, parents, Jamaica, India. How do you think your mom would have seen Kamala Harris?
I think my mother would have been thrilled, really thrilled, very happy. I know that my mother, well, she only just dreamed of someday that there would be a person of color who really knew what they were doing and had that ability to 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 achieve their goals, not just talk. And I know that there was another woman from Alaska who once had that position of being a vice presidential candidate. And my mother was ill at the time, and she didn't live much longer after that. And I had asked my father what mom thought about this, the Alaskan governor and her national race. And my father said my mother just didn't know what to make of it, and said, you know what? She talks and talks, but she doesn't say anything. And my mother just felt like, what is the use of having a female or a person, any person, if they don't actually say anything or don't actually accomplish much? It's sort of like being a stereotype of, you don't have much to say. It sure sounds good, but it doesn't much.
Or being a token.
Yes, right.
Your mom was not a token.
Right.
Far from it. She spoke and she took action. And I was very privileged to have known her when I met her at the FANHS convention in 2000. And like I said, when we find ourselves in this historical period now with someone like a person of color on the national ticket, it just made me think of, well, what would Thelma Buchholdt say?
Right.
I mean, I'm not being partisan here. It's just important that a woman of color is now in this position. Did your mom have those kind of ambitions? Did she ever want to go from Alaska to the federal level, or was the Republican apparatus in Alaska a little too?
I think that my mother would have been happy to have a position of authority. I think she would have liked it if her expertise had been used. When we were in Washington D.C., that was during the George Bush administration, so she wasn't really thinking of having a position in the federal government. And also, my mother is very Alaskan. She wasn't going to be leaving the state. I think she would just look for opportunity, and sometimes opportunity would really show up. One of the things that was very memorable, and I'm just going to close with that because I see it's after 1 o'clock already. One of the things that was an amazing opportunity was that my mother was discovered at the Philippine embassy. She showed up at a meeting, and the Philippine ambassador just thought she was the best, and just absolutely just loved her. And he took her on as an advisor, which is amazing, just really amazing. And so my mother wasn't looking for that kind of an opportunity, but it was like she had skills. Some people would really recognize it. But this goes back to something very humbling. When my mother was in the state legislature and she would work so many hours, long hours, she would be there very late at night while the janitors were coming through. The janitors would think that she was also a janitor. So she knew that she was not a person who thought that she deserved all kinds of breaks. She knew that she had to work hard for everything.
She definitely was, well, she was coming from this position where a Filipino in America in the 50s going, and it's a black and white world, right? She lived through civil rights. That's when she was coming of age. She was working with the indigenous in a place far, far from
On
the
edge of the world.
yeah, far from the lower 48, and yet so accomplished, and served first Filipina to serve in a state legislature. I mean, just talking about your mom, there's so many things that you mentioned that I didn't know. I just knew of her goodness. I knew of her kindness and her generosity. And really, when I went up to Alaska for the first time, it was she introduced me to my first moose. I think it was outside of your,
Yeah. In the front yard. Yeah.
no, it really, I have all these very fond memories of your mom, Thelma Buchholdt. And I hope that for people who are listening to this on our Facebook Live and later on in the recording, learned a little something about your mom that made her so special. And she was. Tell me, what year did she pass?
2007.
Yeah, which is now 13 years ago, but it seems, I mean, my memory of her is still fresh. That it it seems
Yeah.
that it's hard to imagine that it's been that long that she's been gone. So I'm happy that you agreed to come on and talk about her. Is there something that I left out? Is there some great story that
Well, there's a lot, but we only had less than an hour, so my mother's life was quite epic.
all right, tell me the one thing that, God, Emil didn't ask me about this, and that's terrible.
Well, I guess I had sent to you when you had asked me to do this. I had sent to you something I'd written about how my mother, when she was still in the legislature, she joined the National Order of Women Legislators.
Right.
And she determined that she wanted to be involved in that group. There are very few Asian American legislators in the country. And so she started off by running for secretary, and she got that position. She ran for every position as an officer of that organization until she became the very first Asian American legislator to be elected by other legislators in the National Order of Women Legislators. And that's when I heard that, I was like, Mom, you're just a politician's politician. When you have only politicians voting for you, you win. So pretty amazing.
That is amazing, and really, this will be in our museum archives. And I really appreciate you sharing stories about your mom. I know she was a special woman. I pray for her in my rosary prayer every day. I mention Thelma. I mention Thelma because I know she's a force, and I think she's an example for Filipino women, Filipino men, Filipinos all over who are interested in politics. She is an example of
What
how.
can be accomplished? Yes, it's pretty much. I think my mother accomplished the impossible. I mean, it was pretty amazing. But she was very skilled, and a lot of what she did was just intuition. I think she learned a lot from her grandmother on public speaking
At the beach there,
at the beach. Yeah.
talking to the waves, and she was the one who stayed on right to the last. She was the oldest daughter. I mean,
My great grandmother had waited a long time for grandchildren. Her daughter, who stayed behind, didn't get married until she was 30, which is definitely old maid, total old maid, because this was a time when girls were married between the ages of 14 and 17. And for my grandmother not to be married until she was 30, my great grandmother was just so impatient. She really wanted grandchildren. So she took my mother under her wing and said, "This one I'm raising." So I think my mother, when she found out she was dying, of course, it's devastating to find out she had pancreatic cancer. But when she got her diagnosis, the first thing she thought of to cheer herself up was, well, maybe I'll see my grandmother again.
Ty Buchholdt, thank you very much for sharing stories about your mom, Thelma Buchholdt. We honor her on this occasion, historic occasion, right? 100 years, women get the right to vote. We got the Democrats and the Republicans meeting. You see all the politicians on display. We got to talk about maybe one of the finest Filipino American politicians to have existed, your mom.
Thank you.
Ty, thanks for being on this Filipino American National Historical Museum pop-up or National Historical Society Museum pop-up. As you know, go on our Facebook page at FANHS, at FANHS Museum. You'll see posts that talk about how you can donate to the museum's cause. That we're a 501c3. It's tax deductible. And we do these pop-ups talking to people about, historical figures in Filipino American history because, well, we're the museum. And for the last 5 months, we've been closed and we still have to pay rent and we can't have people come to the museum. So we have things like this so people can come or so that we can come to the people virtually. This is the virtual museum. The museum is where you are. If you've enjoyed this program, consider a donation. We'll be back. This will be recorded and put on our website and put on our Facebook page. And we'll be back tomorrow, Sunday, with another program at 2:00 because there's too much history to talk about here on another FANHS Museum pop-up. I'm Emil Guillermo. I'm the museum director. Thank you very much for being with us here on Facebook Live. And thank you, Ty. Thank you for telling stories about your mom. And if we didn't get your comments, it's because we didn't see them. But I will get to them now. I will answer them. I will type in answers now. And really, thank you. Tell your friends about this if they want to know about a phenomenal Filipino American woman, Filipino American politician. I can't think of another one who is really as inspiring as Thelma Buchholdt. Thank you again,
Thanks.
Ty. And now we shall officially end our pop-up.